Hello, hello, welcome back to Loki's Librarian. If you are new here, welcome. I am your librarian, Katrina, and on Sundays I do a thing called Books and Booze where I mix up a cocktail and review a book in the process. It is the last Sunday of the month, meaning it's time for the next president, making this week's book Destiny and Power, The American Odyssey of George Herbert Walker Bush by John Meacham. The accompanying cocktail is a poppy cocktail. It is 1.5 ounces of gin, 3/4 ounces of white creme de cocoa, basically white chocolate, which is what I'm doing. 3/4 ounces. There's actually going to be probably almost 2 ounces in there. Anyways, let's do this. So George H.W. Bush was born June 12, 1924, in Milton, Massachusetts, to Prescott Bush Sr. and Dorothy Walker Bush. He was the second son. His elder brother was Prescott Bush Jr., and so Bush was named for his mother's father, George Herbert Walker. And because the elder Walker was called Pop, Bush was sometimes given the nickname Poppy. Excuse me, not sometimes. He was given the nickname Poppy, and he used that at least through childhood and into early adulthood. I picked a Poppy cocktail because Barbara referred to him as Pops or Poppy, like in her diary and letters and everything else, basically throughout. So I'm like, all right, well, that's appropriate. Let's go with that one. Plus, his preferred cocktail was apparently a vodka martini. I've already mixed a martini once, did not care for it, and that one was a gin martini. But still, I don't think that it's going to get better with vodka. So I'm just going to not do another martini that's not like, chocolate or espresso or something with a little more sugar in it, because God, was a regular martini bitter, bitter, bitter. Okay, I've rambled enough. The clan in general, both the Walkers and the Bushes, were quite wealthy. He was definitely born into a family of privilege and wealth, and he grew up with the belief that with wealth and privilege came an obligation to service. And it was service, not power, that drew him to the public sector later in life. And we're going to come back to that. He was raised in Greenwich, Connecticut, and he went to Greenwich Country Day School for the primary school, which was, of course, very chic and wealthy, and then to Phillips Academy, where he graduated high school in 1942. All throughout this time, he basically had 3 family residences, the primary one in Greenwich, where he lived with his mom and dad, and then they would summer in Kennebunkport, Maine, at the Walker family house up there, or in South Carolina at the Walker family plantation. So, again, wealth on both sides of the family. It's very, very moneyed. He was at Phillips Academy. I'm mentioning that because it's disingenuous to say it's not relevant. All right, it certainly was relevant, but it's not what his driving factor was. He was not a trust fund baby. I mean, yes, he certainly grew up with certain privileges and abilities because of the family wealth, but he definitely made it on his own as an adult, which we'll come back to again in a little bit. Now, he was at Phillips Academy when Pearl Harbor happened, and he enlisted in the U.S. Navy right out of high school. Remember, he was born in June. He became, on his 18th birthday, he went down and enlisted. I feel like back then he had to have his father's permission because he wasn't 20 or 21 or something like that, but I'm not going to swear to that. I might be misremembering. He enlisted on his 18th birthday, was immediately routed to pilot training, and he served in the Pacific Theater, flying combat missions as a torpedo bomber, and he was shot down over Chichijima on September 2nd, 1944. Let me shake this up. Now, the part of the book about his service was very detailed because it really was some formative experiences going in there, and it's easy to see why, right? I mean, being shot down in combat is going to form you in some fashion or another, whether you are caught and held as a prisoner of war or whether, as in Bush's case, he managed to make it out and was picked up later. It's something that stayed with him all of his life, and not just because he was shot down, but because he was the only crew member to live to tell about it. And just to be very clear here, he followed all the correct protocols. He gave the absolute correct order to bail when he realized the plane wasn't going to make it. Other pilots in the area heard him give the order to bail out, and just he was the only one who made it. Whether that is, because the other crew members didn't hear him over adrenaline, or they made it out but their parachutes failed to open, or maybe they made it out and were captured on Chichijima and just never seen again. For whatever reason, their bodies were never found, so we never know. Bush felt extreme guilt about this for the rest of his life. Like, why was he the one who lived? And he didn't need to, because none of it was his fault, truly. I mean, when he got back to some place where he could send letters, he sent letters to the families of his crew apologizing for their loss for the loved ones. And the sister of one of the men wrote back and said that he didn't need to apologize. Her brother always spoke very highly of him, and she was quite sure it was not his fault. Let's try poppy. That's not too shabby. That's very creamy. So anyways, after he bails out of his plane, he drifted for a bit on his life raft, pedaling with his arms away from the island because the Oh, I have a cat up there. I'm like, what the hell am I hearing? I have a cat in the cat bed up there. The tides were actually pulling him towards the island. And man, if you know anything at all about World War II history, you do not want to be a prisoner of war in a Japanese camp. Let me put it this way. Hitler stole some of his best ideas from the Japanese and still didn't come even close to the Japanese in terms of imagination for what was possible with torture in the human body. There's definitely rumors of cannibalism. Bush was eventually picked up by a U.S. submarine that was patrolling the area specifically to look for downed U.S. fighter pilots. Like that was their mission, was to retrieve anybody who made it out of a plane. When he returned stateside on leave in late December 1944, he married his high school sweetheart, Barbara Pierce, who he had met at a Christmas dance in December 1941, like right after Pearl Harbor. They were both still in high school, and they went to different schools because the academy, what did they say, Peterson Academy? Phillips Academy was a boys' school. But he went to a school at a local dance, saw her. It was basically love at first sight on both their parts. And they were quickly engaged. And it would be a long engagement because they didn't marry until January 6th, 1945. And from that point, they were together basically constantly. Like I said, very much a love match. They would have 6 children together, although their second born, which was Pauline Robinson Bush, a.k.a. Robin, would die of leukemia when she was 3 years old in 1953. She was like just 3 months shy of her 4th birthday. As you can imagine, this was absolutely devastating for the entire family. The Bush clan, the Walker clan, the Bush nucleus family, George H.W., Barbara, their oldest son, George W., and then Jeb had just been born when Robin was diagnosed. So they were all very devastated by this. I mean, leukemia was known but virtually untreatable back then. It's not much better now. I mean, if they catch it early, they can kind of treat it and get you to a stasis point, but it's still a long way from being cured. I should reference last week's book about all the knowledge we lost when they burned the library at Alexandria. When young Robin passed, the family donated her body to science so the doctors could study her and try and find better treatments. The body was returned a few days later, and she was buried in the Bush family plot in Greenwich, Connecticut. Later in 2000, they exhumed her and reinterred at the George H.W. Bush Library in Texas so that when her parents eventually passed, they could all be buried together. Pivotal moment, having a child die, and it speaks to the strength of their marriage that they survived that, because a lot of families don't survive the death of a child. Now, after he was discharged from active duty, Bush went to Yale, where he majored in economics, and from there it was bye baby bird, fly free, as both sides of the family would provide moral support but no financial support. So he was very much on his own once he graduated college. Both clans believed that you needed to make it on your own, not coast on the family dime with an unlimited trust fund. And that's a work ethic he instilled in his own kids, too. And that's impressive, all right? Because there are a lot of trust fund babies out there who, all they do is suck up parent trust. Now, Bush took a job offer with an oil company in Texas, and the family moved there. They bounced around a bit. They lived in California for a bit, and then moved back to Texas, where Bush would branch out and first he formed the Bush Overby Oil Development Company, then eventually Zapata Petroleum Corporation, and then became the president of Zapata Offshore Company, which is a subsidiary of Zapata Petroleum. And he was in the oil industry from his graduation at Yale in 1948 until he entered politics in the early 1960s, initially trying to run for the U.S. Senate from Texas in 1964, which election he lost, and realized that part of why he lost is that he had been splitting his time between his political aspirations and his oil company. So when he decided to run for Congress, U.S. House of Representatives in 1966, he sold his share of Zapata and went all in. And he sold it for a pretty penny. The author was kind enough to do the math, and the amount was a couple of $100,000 back then, but adjusted for inflation, it would be about $5 million for today's company, which is decent, right? I mean, a lot of people could live comfortably on that if they weren't profligate. He ran for House of Representatives in 1966, won his race. He was seated with the 90th Congress in 1967. And Bush was so affable and likable. And those are like his two major qualities that just kind of burst through the pages. He was just a likable guy, that he had requested to be assigned to the Appropriations Committee and was instead given Ways and Means, which is historically seen as the most powerful committee in the House, is the Ways and Means Committee. I did a little Google search on it. Well, I went to the U.S. House.gov or whatever, the official House page for the U.S. government, and to see what exactly those were. Appropriations determines what money is needed, and Ways and Means, which is the oldest standing committee, actually derives itself directly from the U.S. Constitution, specifically Article 1, Section 7, which declares, quote, all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. So Ways and Means is the power to tax. And Bush was so likable that as a freshman congressman, Minority Leader Gerald Ford put him on Ways and Means as a junior congressman. He was the youngest member of Congress to sit on that committee since 1904. They usually put senior guys on there. But he was so likable. He had the background in economics. They're like, yeah, let's put you on Ways and Means. And so he served there for 2 terms before attempting another stab at the Senate in 1970, which he also lost. So now he's in a pickle. He's 46 years old. He has no job, right? I mean, yes, he has money in savings, right? His sale of the Zapata shares would last for quite a bit, but he's got 5 kids. At least one of them is in college, right? He's got Bush Senior or Bush Junior in college. Bush 2 is in college. It's just not enough to retire on indefinitely, and he's only 46. All right, I mean, okay, Gen X, baby boomers, Gen X, and millennials for sure. We all think of, hey, I'd love to retire at 46 and never have to work, but that's not how he was raised. He was raised to work and to serve, and he's finished his working career. He wants to go into service now. So he could have returned to Texas and picked up with the oil industry, but he didn't want to do that. So instead, he waited for various strings to pull and his connections to come through because, again, affable, likable guy, and he got a job offer from Nixon, initially to work as a presidential aide, but Bush talked Nixon instead into making him the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in New York. And Nixon had tried to talk him into living in Greenwich and commuting in and possibly making a stab at senator again from Connecticut, but Bush declined, and he lived in the UN ambassador apartment in New York. Apparently, this is an entire big building where it's not just the offices, but the residences of the ambassadors. Excuse me, I don't know. This is the impression I got from the book. And he was very friendly, got along with everybody there. Very likable. Again, the likability just pops off the pages, man. And Bush was exceptional in this role because of his likability. And he was great at compromise. He was great at making friends. Meacham says that Bush believed that the best way to make a friend was to be a friend. And he credits somebody specifically for that quote, but it may have been Abraham Lincoln. It might have been Thomas Jefferson. It was one of the earlier presidents. I couldn't find the quote specifically online, so I don't remember who he quoted. But it's a credo that Bush embraced, and because of that, he embraced everyone as a friend he just hadn't met yet. Again, if you want to have a friend, be a friend. And he was a great friend to everybody he ever met. I really like this one. I might have to make a second one because there's not a lot to it. It's easy to make. I should have enough to make a second one. He was ambassador to the UN for 2 years, and then in 1972, Nixon asked him to step in as the chairman of the Republican National Committee. Which Bush didn't really care for this. This wasn't what he wanted to do, but service, right? Raised to serve. He had been raised that if the president asks you to do something, you serve in that capacity and with good cheer, because that is where you're needed. And so as chairman of the RNC, he defended Nixon on Watergate until it was no longer possible to do so, when it became glaringly obvious that Nixon was not being upfront and candid about everything. And then it just became a matter of kind of watching a dead man walking around the White House as Nixon got more and more cornered on this issue until eventually he obviously stepped down and passed it over to Ford. Now, when Ford stepped into the top spot, he briefly considered having Bush as his vice presidential candidate. He ultimately chose Rockefeller because around this time rumors surfaced that Bush had received campaign funding from Nixon for his 1970 bid for the Senate seat. He had not, and he was ultimately cleared of this allegation. By the time the dust settled, it was already a done deal. Rockefeller was VP, and Bush was done being chairman of the RNC. Ford, however, very smart man. He recognized the diplomatic skills. It's a rare soul who sees everybody as a friend no matter what, right? Until proven otherwise. And he recognized that in Bush, and so he sent him to China. Put him in foreign service work and placed Bush as the head of the U.S. liaison office in China, where he was for a year and a half, like a year and a half. I mean, he did meet Chairman Mao, and he made an overall good impression on the Chinese. Like, while there, he and Barbara, instead of like having the diplomatic car and the American flags and everything, they just adopted the bicycle as their preferred mode of transportation. And since this was also the Chinese people's preferred method of transportation, they just loved him for it. Thought he was a very cool guy. After like the year and a half or whatever, he was pulled back to the U.S. to become the director of the CIA, in which capacity he served until Carter was sworn in. Now, he obliquely offered to continue in that capacity, but Carter declined. And I gotta say, Meacham does not directly bash any one president in the book. He's mainly respectful of all those who have served in this capacity, but Carter, I'm developing opinions about Carter. Every time I hit a bit about him, he does not come off well. He comes off as arrogant and condescending. He slides a little bit lower in my rankings of good presidents and good people. I thought he was genuinely a good person after he finished the White House, and now I just think he was kind of an arrogant prick. We'll come back to that. Oh, good. No. Come on, power. Come back on. Shit. Well, let's go until my emergency power supply cuts out. Anyway, back to Bush. He steps... My power is going in and out. I'm trying to finish this before it cuts out entirely. Emergency power supplies keep running. Bush steps down as director of the CIA when Carter steps up, and he immediately starts planning to run for president in 1980. So it's 1977 now. He begins kind of putting out feelers and networking, and he gets damn close. And he really did make Reagan sweat for that nomination. And Reagan, in turn, made him sweat for the VP position. Meacham explains just how close it came to actually being for it again before the call was made inviting Bush to join the ticket. And he was outstanding as a VP. I mean, truly, from everything described in here, he understood his role as the second in command, right? Not even second, like arguably Secretary of State is the second, because he needs to be briefed and aware of everything in case catastrophe happens, but he knew he wasn't the president. He never overstepped, and when he saw something was wrong or thought Reagan was erring, he discussed it with Reagan. Reagan, for his part, made that quite easy by having a weekly lunch with his vice president, and when Reagan was shot, Bush was in Texas, ironically placing a plaque for JFK at the hotel he'd stayed at the night before his assassination. Bush quickly flew back to D.C., and when he got there, took a car. Even though a helicopter ride to the White House was offered, and it would have been faster, his logic was quite simple. Landing via helicopter on, I think it's the South Lawn or maybe it's the East Lawn, that's what the president does. And he is not the president. So it would not be proper for him to make this transition, to make this journey via helicopter, because the president's not dead yet. As far as he knew, he was still in surgery. Now, on Iran-Contra, the only thing Bush was aware of was the brokering of missiles for hostages. He was kept in the loop on that. He does not appear to have known about the direct sale of any missiles, and definitely was not aware of money being supplied to the Contras in Nicaragua. All of this is supported by his diaries and journal entries, where he expresses genuine surprise and dismay at what happened. Bush easily won election in 1988 with endorsement from Reagan, and immediately set about running the country. Now, Bush is better known for his statecraft than for domestic policy, a fact that is widely known, and even Bush acknowledges it multiple times in this book. Bush was interviewed extensively. He gave the author a free rein to read and use his diaries and notes. At one point, Bush admits that Americans care less about foreign policy than they do the economy, and they'll vote on the economy. And he's absolutely accurate on that, right? They voted on the economy. Well, okay, they were sick of the corruption when they voted Ford out, and that's fair. The Republicans, Ford did a good job, but it was a clusterfuck. So they gave Carter a chance. But Carter's absolute shit show on the economy, yeah, lost in the election. Reagan cut taxes, the economy boomed for 8 years. They voted him back in. And then Bush stepped in and cared more about foreign policy than he did what was happening in the United States. It's not to say he didn't care, he did, but all of this is to say that it leads me to wonder if Bush actually wanted to be reelected, because he commented on Americans voting on the economy as early as like 1990. It never really did much about the economy. The only thing he did do was sign a law raising taxes, but he never held firm on cut spending. And after his fateful campaign promise of read my lips, no new taxes, I mean, it kind of shot himself in the foot. And he marks that as kind of his biggest political blunder, which is fair, because that really is what most likely cost him the re-election. But while he was president, he oversaw some truly epic changes in world history. I mean, he got on quite well with Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. And when the Berlin Wall fell on November 9th, 1989, Bush's response was measured and calm. I mean, some politicos here in the United States were calling for him to fly to Berlin and be part of this historic moment, but he declined. He didn't want the Soviets to think that America was dancing on their grave, which was smart, incredibly smart, because that would have led to some major bad feelings. He'd already been getting along with Gorbachev from his time as vice president, and rather than twisting the screw, turning the screw, what happened is, because Gorbachev appreciated his measured, congratulations, you're doing the right thing response, it allowed Gorbachev to allow various Soviet satellite states to just quietly withdraw from the USSR and vote themselves into their own nationhood again. And each time, Bush congratulated him, didn't go over and roll in tanks or do anything else. He just said these countries need to control their own destiny. You're doing the right thing by letting them do so. Kind of a positive reinforcement, and it was very smart. It allowed Gorbachev to abandon the Brezhnev Doctrine, which basically calls for Central Soviet intervention in any satellite state that threatened Soviet dominance. And I'm paraphrasing that quite significantly, right? But you can Google the Brezhnev Doctrine for more details if you'd like. When Gorbachev met with Bush after the wall fell, so the wall fell in November 1989, they met in December 89, Bush quietly boxed him into a conversational corner, and they were just talking, where Bush allowed that a reunited Germany could in fact join NATO if they wanted to. And that very subtle diplomacy through conversation was trademark Bush. This is what he was well known for and was appreciated for globally by other world leaders. The two men remained friendly throughout the remaining days of the Soviet Union, although it did get a bit dicey when hardline communists tried a coup in August of 1991. Again, politicos were pushing Bush to do something, anything, and Bush declined because this was an entirely internal Soviet affair. It would have been grossly improper for him to roll tanks into Soviet Russia on behalf of Gorbachev. He didn't know what the people on the ground wanted, and it's up for the people to make that determination. And that refusal surprised people because of Bush's military successes in Panama and Kuwait in the prior 2 years. But again, Bush was a master at reading which way the winds were blowing and correcting course as needed. This was very much a strength of his. He knew the situations were entirely different and handled each on its own merit. Now, in May 1989, to back up a little bit and give you guys some of that background, drug kingpin Manuel Noriega, he tried to overturn the results of Panamanian elections based entirely on his past relations with the United States. The CIA had funneled money through Noriega, who was heavily involved in drug trafficking. I'm sure there's a lot of conspiracy theories there. I'm hoping to read some of them this year, or 2025 year. Noriega seemed to think that he could overthrow a democratically elected president in Panama because he had ties to U.S. intelligence agencies. And Bush disabused him of this notion. He did send troops down, but it only started an active campaign when Panamanian forces under Noriega shot and killed a U.S. service member who was in Panama on military drills. Otherwise, he would have just let it ride. Make another one. I still have 2 pages, so I'm going to make another one. Ooh, maybe I'm going to make another one. This is going to be a slightly more creamy one because I'm going to kill 2 bottles right here. Pocket. All right. Shake this up. For the first Gulf Wars, here we're definitely entering into my, adult memories. I wasn't an adult, but I was 14? 14, I think. Maybe 15? Wait, 91. August. Yeah, 14. For the first Gulf War, right, we had Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait in August of 1990. Bush did not just run over there and defend oil. I know that that's kind of very much the given impression 30 years later, but that's not what happened. He knew from intelligence reports that Saddam Hussein was a sadistic megalomaniac. He controlled a significant portion of the world's oil supply as is because of Iraq. Allowing him to take over the Kuwaiti oil fields would have been catastrophic globally. So he approached the UN Security Council and got backing from everybody. I think there were 3 countries that were no, maybe not. But Gorbachev helped with that. Gorbachev backed him and said, yes, we should not let Saddam Hussein roll in and just take over Kuwait. Significantly, the other oil-rich Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, they also supported the military movement. I mean, they were a little bit hesitant because, okay, what if this is, empire building on the part of the United States? But if the United States does what they say, which is just to push Iraqi forces back into Iraq and not topple and not king make, not try and remove Saddam Hussein directly, then they were all on board with that. And Bush knew this was very delicate, that he had to do exactly what he said he would do, no more, no less. Bush initially, immediately, as soon as it happened, imposed sanctions on Iraq and gave them until January 15th, 1991 to withdraw. And he began positioning U.S. troops for the war just to cover his own butt legally. He began positioning U.S. troops for the war. So he started flying them over there in huge numbers. I mean, he was not going to do a Vietnam thing where he did a couple here, a couple there. He sent an enormous force over there. Then he petitioned Congress for approval because he wanted to cover himself legally. I mean, his diary entries show that he was absolutely willing to risk impeachment and proceed without congressional approval if required. That's how strongly he believed that Iraq was overstepping and this needed to happen. It was a damn effective military presence. I mean, January 15, 1991 rolls around, Iraq hasn't moved, and the fighting lasted for 100 hours. Boom, that's less than a week, man, of actual fighting. Following this, Bush's approval rating soared to 89%, which is the absolute highest of any president since they started taking approval polls. It's higher even than Truman at the end of World War II. I mean, it was during the part on the Gulf War, though, this is where I started to develop a genuine distaste for former President Carter. I mean, previously I'd said, when I did the book on Carter, I was like, he was kind of a shit, ineffective president, but probably a genuinely good person. Here's where I started thinking he was an egomaniac shithead. And Bush was not too impressed either. See, Bush's Secretary of State was a longtime friend, Jim Baker. And it wasn't just a friend. Baker was eminently qualified for this position. And I think he was the Secretary of State. Okay, Jim Baker had been Secretary of Treasury first. No, excuse me, I got that backwards. He was the Chief of Staff under Reagan first, White House Chief of Staff. Then he was the Treasury Secretary, and now he was Secretary of State under Bush. So he was eminently qualified. It wasn't just that he was a friend. He was a qualified friend to do the job. And Jim Baker was very willing to go to Baghdad and do what diplomats do. He was willing to try and talk the situation down. The problem Bush saw with that was that negotiating with Saddam on this matter legitimizes his claim to invading Iraq. And they would have to give some sort of concession to Iraq if they had to withdraw if they did that. And he didn't want to do that because Iraq was wrong. They should not have invaded Kuwait. Carter also wanted to be an emissary to Baghdad, which Bush was opposed to for the same reasons. Additionally, Bush hated freelance diplomacy. Right? And this incidentally makes me think of when I read the Carter book, the author there was very bitter and absolutely positive that Bush had swung some backdoor diplomacy deals of his own to get the American hostages in Iran released after Reagan was elected. Bush never did. As stated under the Reagan book, he was absolutely 100% cleared of that, and the allegations never went anywhere. But Carter remained bitter and certain, and so I'm pretty sure Carter was just a arrogant, backstabby prick. Carter took this further, because when Bush wouldn't let him go over there and try and smooth talk things with Kuwait, Carter wrote directly to members of the UN Security Council, urging them to vote against the resolution seeking international sanction for use of force. Meaning he didn't want sanctions against Iraq for the invasion of Kuwait. He didn't want anything. He wanted the UN to step back and let him deal with it. And my God. I mean, he wanted to go in, show himself to be the hero peacekeeper, and that's quite a bit backstabby. I mean, generally speaking, in all the books I've read about the presidents, once they're out, they may have their opinions on what a current president is doing, but they'll never act on those opinions. They rarely voice them out loud. I think that one of the few times that they were voiced out loud was Pierce? Yeah, I think it was Pierce during the Civil War, and the Secret Service showed up and were like, hey, you can't be talking about this. And he's like, hey, I am a U.S. citizen. I remain loyal to the United States, but I'm allowed to voice my opinion. And that's the closest it ever got. But man, because they know the stress that goes into the job, they just keep their opinions to themselves. They don't actually go out and try and underwrite the sitting president or undercut the sitting president. I mean, fuck Carter, man. What a dick. All of that exposition, Panama, Iraq, was to say that those called for different measured responses to the attempted coup in the Soviet Union. Panama may never have happened if Panamanian forces had not killed a U.S. service member. Gulf War I definitely would not have happened if Iraq had not invaded Kuwait. And everyone's saying we had no business going into another country for oil. Like, quit bitching about drilling for oil here in the United States. I mean, we have a ton of oil here in the United States, but you assholes all bitch about it. And so, hey, if you want the world to keep moving on a smoothly greased skids, we have to have oil for that to happen. And currently that oil is in Kuwait. Quit bitching about it, man. Get your panties untwisted about drilling locally. I mean, Bush well remembered the gas rationing from the 1970s. I mean, hell, I dare say that's the other part of why Carter butted in. I mean, first was because he genuinely believed Bush had, fucked him over with the Iranian hostages, even though by this point in time it had been conclusively proven no. All conspiracy theories die hard. There's a lot of gin in this. The Soviet Union was all internal. All right? None of that had any play here in the United States. And all Bush could do was pray for Gorbachev and offer support to Boris Yeltsin, who was backing Gorbachev all the way. Because he's only getting part of the picture, right? And he's got people on the ground saying, no, the people in Russia want Gorbachev in power. They don't want a reinstitution of the former Soviet blocs. But he had to let them fight their own battles on that one. Because if he had rolled in, that absolutely would have heated up the Cold War. Right? And he's this close to winning it. This close, like teeny tiny, that close to winning it, right? He can't just roll tanks in to back his friend Gorbachev. That would have made Gorbachev appear weak. It would have undercut everything, and everything would have heated back up. Gorbachev absolutely would have lost everything at that point. Because the Soviet people, no matter how much they didn't want a reinstitution, a return to Stalinism, would not have wanted American troops rolling through their streets. They would not have wanted that. And so all he did was pray. And that's all he could do, was pray and be a sounding board for Boris Yeltsin, which is what he did. And it worked. The coup failed. Bush was deeply relieved. He received a call from Gorbachev like 4 days later that the coup attempt had failed. And he was very proud of that, very relieved to hear that. And then he received another call from Gorbachev on December 26, 1991, announcing that Gorbachev had signed the paperwork for the dissolution of the Soviet Union and resigned as president. And the Cold War was officially over. Would not have happened had he rolled tanks. So I'm very glad to that effect that we had Bush in office at that point in time, because his measured response was exactly what the world needed right then. Now, he did run in 92. He was horrified that Clinton won. Not just news of Clinton's infidelity, that had definitely made it out, but I think what he was more appalled by was that Clinton was famously a draft dodger, which Bush just could not fathom. I mean, remember, he enlisted the moment he was eligible to do so and saw combat. But again, I'm not sure how serious he was about a second term. And the book makes it clear, wow, that's an interesting typo. Let's fix that because that'll never show up on a spell check. The book makes it clear that Bush was never really sure how serious he was about a second term. It's easy to say, yes, he ran with all his might, but did he? Because if he knew as early as 1990 that the American people would vote on the economy, you would think he would have made the economy his primary fix, and he never did. He was, post-presidency, immensely proud of his son George W. when George W. won the presidency in 2000. He never tried to direct or guide the presidency. He acted as a sounding board in support of father, which is proper. That's what he should do. Bush 43 asked his father and former President Clinton to travel to Thailand in the wake of the tsunami there as the sort of goodwill ambassadors, and again to the Gulf Coast following Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And through these travels, Bush came to like Clinton quite a bit. I mean, he never warmed to Hillary, which is fair. She's kind of a screeching harpy. He speculated that the Clintons' relationship may have been a bit like Eleanor and FDR, which I'll learn more about next month. He thought it might have been a marriage in name only. And other than they had one child, but FDR and Eleanor had children too, and their marriage was certainly not a happy thing. Bush was still alive when this book went to press in 2015, but he died on November 30th, 2018. He was 95 years old. Barbara had preceded him in death by a few months. She passed on April 17th, 2018, and I believe both are buried, I think in Houston, next to their daughter Robin, at the wherever the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library is. That's where the family is buried. This book was excellent. It was highly readable. It was well-rounded. It tells the complete story of a man who lived an absolutely astounding life. I mean, my God. The author spoke with all of Bush's successors, like all of them, Clinton, Bush 43, and Obama. They all had nothing but good things to say about Bush 41. I gotta stop drinking while I read these things. Okay. President Obama actually granted him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest award that a civilian can receive. And his remarks about Bush 41 left me crying. I'm going to cry again because they were really well put. It put a different perspective for me on President Obama. And I've always been a bit ambivalent about our 44th president. But his remarks on Bush 41 were so thoughtful and honest. That section on what the former presidents thought, or the successors thought about him, really drives home for me that the divide that is shown so freely on the evening news is very much for entertainment purposes only. Remember that, guys. We are consuming the entertainment that is Washington, D.C. All right? Ultimately, they are all co-workers. They all understand the enormity of what goes into sitting in the Oval Office. Maybe that grants them grace for their predecessors, except for Carter. I mean, fuck that guy. That's it for this week. If you like what you saw, don't forget to subscribe. I will see you guys next Sunday. Bye.